The parish of Ardwell in Suffolk had a custom about carriages, and like most customs it had never been written down anywhere, and everybody in that county knew it exactly. After the morning service, the gentry went home in their carriages. The upper servants and the dependents walked. It was 2 miles and a quarter from the church gate to Ardwell Hall by the road, and rather less than 2 by the field path, when the field path was dry, which between November and April it was not. Honor Trewin had walked it for 4 years and 2 months. She was 23 years old. She was the daughter of Sir Marcus Ferris's dead sister, which made her the niece of the house by blood and nothing at all by anything else, because her father had been a naval officer who died at Basque Roads, leaving £1,100 of debt, and a widow who followed him inside the year, and there was no portion, and there had never been any question of a portion. What there was instead was an arrangement. She lived at Ardwell Hall. She had a room on the 2nd floor at the end of the passage, above the still room, which was cold in a particular way that a room over a still room is cold. She read to her aunt in the afternoons, she wrote her aunt's letters, she went through the household books on a Friday, she sat up with her aunt when her aunt could not sleep, and she was not paid, because she was family, and because a lady's companion who is paid is a servant, and a lady's companion who is not paid is a relation, and the difference between those two things was the only thing Honor Trewin owned. Lady Sarah Ferrers was not a cruel woman. It is important to understand that, because the whole of this depends on it, and the story is worth nothing if she is made into a monster. She was a woman of 51, with a great deal of anxiety and very little consequence, married to a baronet whose land was mortgaged in 3 directions, in a county where consequence was the only currency anybody actually spent. She was frightened almost all the time. And a frightened woman with a poor relation in the house will find, sooner or later, that the poor relation is the one place in the world where her own footing can be made to feel firmer, and she will put her weight on it without ever once deciding to. So Honor walked. Every Sunday in all weathers for 4 years and 2 months, while the Ferrers carriage went by her on the road, and it was not remarked on by anybody, because there was nothing in it to remark on. That was simply what the arrangement was. Now, the 24th of April, 1814, Aubrey Massingham, 6th Duke of Rayshalt, had come into Suffolk in the February to look at a property at Stow-Marden that his agent thought he ought to buy, and had then stayed on, which nobody had expected, and everybody was extremely pleased about, because a duke in residence in a thin county in a thin spring is worth more to the local sense of itself than any amount of money. He was 31. He had come into the title at 24 when his elder brother went into the Douro and did not come out, and he had spent the 7 years since doing the work of it, which is duller than anybody who has not done it imagines. Rents, roofs, drains, 300 people's livings, and a mother. He was promised, not engaged. This distinction mattered enormously at the time, and is almost impossible to feel now. There was no settlement drawn, and no announcement made, and there was an understanding of 11 years' standing between the late Duke and the Marquess of Ilminster, that Rayshalt would marry Ilminster's second daughter, Lady Georgiana Hivers, and that understanding had been given as his father's word in his father's last month, and Aubrey Massingham had said yes to a dying man in a room in Hertfordshire, and he had meant it. He liked Lady Georgiana. That is not a small thing, and it is not the same as the other thing. On the 24th of April, the Duke of Rayshult attended the morning service at Ardwell with his mother, the Dowager Duchess, and his sister, Lady Emily, and Lady Georgiana Havers, who was staying at Stow Marden with the Ilminster party, and it was the largest congregation Ardwell had had in 11 years, because the whole county came to look at them. There were about 90 people in that churchyard afterwards. That figure is not a guess. The rector, Mr. Bradnam, put it in a letter that week. And at the gate where the carriages were brought round, Lady Sarah Ferrers had a difficulty. The Ferrers' carriage held 4. It held 4 with Lady Sarah, Sir Marcus, their daughter Miss Amelia Ferrers, and Honour. It had held those 4 to church that morning, because going to church is a thing the county sees you do, and a niece in the carriage looks better than a niece on the road. And now Lady Georgiana Havers wished to see Ardwell Hall, and had said so pleasantly to Lady Sarah in front of everybody, and there was no carriage for her because the Ilminster party had come in too, and both were full. Lady Sarah Ferrers had about 4 seconds. She said, out loud at the gate, in front of about 90 people, that of course Lady Georgiana must come in theirs, and that Honour would walk, and that Honour always walked, and did not mind it in the least. That is the whole of the cruelty. There is nothing else in it. She did not sneer, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not say one word that was untrue. Honour did always walk. Honour had never once said she minded. What Lady Sarah did was say it in front of the county, take the arrangement that everybody had politely agreed not to look at, and hold it up at the church gate in the sunshine, and name it out loud, because she needed 4 seconds' worth of consequence in front of a Marcus's daughter, and her niece was where the footing was. Honour Trewin curtsied, and said that she should enjoy the walk very much, and turned to go. Somebody laughed. It was not much of a laugh. It came from over by the yews, from a party of 3 or 4, and it was the noise people make when something has gone slightly wrong in public, and they would like it to be a joke so that it can stop being anything else. She heard it. Everybody heard it. It was that kind of quiet. And then the Duke of Rayshult, who was 11 feet away with his hat in his hand, said, "I shall walk with Miss Trewin." That is all he said. There is no version of this in which he made a speech, and every version in which he does has been improved by somebody. He gave his mother his arm as far as her carriage, and handed her up into it, and handed his sister up after her, and stood back while Lady Georgiana Havers was handed into the Ferrers' carriage by Sir Marcus. And then he put his hat on, and walked out through the gate onto the Ardwell Road, beside a portionless young woman in a 4-year-old pelisse, and his own carriage came along behind them at a walking pace, empty, for 2 miles and a quarter. 90 people watched him do it. Now, what did that cost? And why? It is very easy, from here, to think a man went for a walk. So it is worth being exact, because if the cost is not understood, then nothing that follows makes any sense at all, and this is the part that people get wrong. A duke's carriage is not transport. In 1814, in a county like that one, a carriage is a statement of rank made in wood and paint and horseflesh, and who is inside it and who is outside it is the plainest sentence anybody in that country could read. To go on foot when your carriage is standing there beside a person who has just been publicly identified as somebody who walks is to say, in front of 90 witnesses, that you do not accept the sentence they have just written. And there is no way to do that quietly, and there is no way to do it once. The Dowager Duchess of Rayshalt understood it before the carriage door was shut. She said nothing at the gate. She was a woman who never said anything at a gate. Lady Georgiana Havers understood it too, from inside the Ferrers' carriage, going up the Ardwell Road at a trot, past them, twice, because a carriage at a trot passes a walking pair, and then must slow at the Ardwell turn, and is passed by nobody, and arrives at the hall 25 minutes before them. She had 25 minutes in Lady Sarah Ferris's drawing room to think about it. She was 19. She behaved that afternoon and afterwards better than almost anybody in this story, and the county understood it by Tuesday. Because 90 people is not a secret. It is a broadcast. What did they actually talk about on that road? Very little, and Honor Trewin was asked about it for the rest of her life, and her answer never got any better. She said he asked her about the field path and whether it was passable in March, and she said it was not, and he asked her what she read to her aunt in the afternoons, and she said whatever was in the house, and he asked her what she would read if it were not, and she did not answer that for about a quarter of a mile. Then she said something with a great deal of the sea in it, and the Duke of Rayshalt said that his brother had been a sailor, and did not say anything else for a while. That is the entire recorded content of the first walk. 2 people talking about a footpath. He was at the church gate the following Sunday, the 1st of May. This is where it stops being a gesture and starts being the thing it actually was. And it is worth pausing on, because a single walk on a fine April day is a courtesy, and a man can perform a courtesy and go home and be admired for it, and lose nothing, whatever. He came back. He was there on the 1st of May, and the 8th, and the 15th. He handed his mother into her carriage each time, and then walked the Ardwell Road, and by the 3rd Sunday there was no longer any possibility of anybody in that county mistaking it for good manners. By the 4th Sunday, the 22nd of May, 3 things had happened, and Honor Trewin knew about exactly one of them. The first was that the Dowager Duchess of Rayshalt had written to the Marquess of Ilminster. It was a careful letter, and its substance was that the understanding between the 2 houses should either be put onto a proper footing at once or be considered at an end, and that she wrote in the hope of the former. The second was that the Marquess of Ilminster had come to Stowmarden in person and had spent an hour and a half with the Duke of Rayshalt alone in the library, and that no account of what was said in that room has ever existed, because both men were the kind who do not repeat such conversations, and both were dead within 12 years. What is known is that Ilminster came out of that library and ordered his carriage for the following morning, and took his daughter home to Somerset. The third thing was Lady Sarah Ferrers, and this is the one Honor knew about, because it happened to her. Her aunt stopped speaking to her on the 9th of May. Not entirely. She spoke to her about the letters and the household books and the hour of dinner. What stopped was everything else, and it stopped completely, and it went on for 11 weeks. Honor Trewin, at 23, in a cold room above a still room, with no portion, no father, no mother, no money of her own, and nowhere in England to go, was cut in the only house she had, by the only relation she had, for the crime of having been walked home from church by a man who had not asked her permission to do it. She could not stop him. That is worth saying plainly. A young woman of no standing cannot forbid a duke to walk on a public road, and any attempt to do so would have been a scene. And a scene would have finished her. So she walked, every Sunday, beside a man who was ruining a betrothal for her and had never said so, and went home to a house where her aunt looked past her at dinner, and read to that aunt in the afternoons, in a voice that did not change. She wrote one letter about it, in June, to a school friend in Ipswich. And it survives. And there is a single sentence in it that is the reason anybody remembers Honor Trewin at all. She wrote, "I do not know what he means by it, and I have decided that I shall not find out by asking, because if I ask him, he will have to answer, and then whatever it is will be over." The county spent that summer deciding what it thought, and the way it went about it is worth watching, because it is not what people expect. Nobody was scandalized. That is the first thing. There was no outrage in Ardwell and no indignation, and not one person in that parish thought the Duke of Rayshalt was doing anything wicked, because he was not. What they thought was that he was making a mistake, and they were sorry about it. In the particular way a county is sorry about a man of rank who is about to do himself harm attentively and out loud, and with a great deal of sympathy for everybody except the woman. The sentence that got repeated, and it was repeated in a dozen drawing rooms between May and August, was that it was very hard on Lady Georgiana. Nobody said it was hard on Honor Trewin. It did not occur to anybody that anything was happening to Honor Trewin at all. She was the road the thing was travelling along, and underneath the sympathy there was the other thing, which was arithmetic, and which nobody said out loud in a drawing room, and everybody had done. A duke does not marry a naval officer's portionless daughter, not because it is forbidden, because it is not. There was no law and no rule and nothing to prevent it. He does not do it because the whole apparatus of what he is, the tenants, the interest, the seat, the connection, the 60 families, whose position depends on his, is held together by marriages that put weight where weight is needed. And a marriage that puts no weight anywhere is a hole in it. Marrying Honor Trewin would cost him nothing in money, and a very great deal of everything else, and every person in that county could have told you so, and so could he. That is the arithmetic the whole county had done by June, and it is why they were all so certain about how it would end. They were certain he would stop. Not cruelly. That was never suggested. What everybody in Ardwell expected, and said to one another with a kind of comfortable regret, was that the Duke of Rayshalt would go back into Hertfordshire at the end of the summer, and that the walks would simply stop happening, the way such things stop, and that Miss Trewin would go on reading to her aunt, and that in 11 years' time it would be a thing that had happened once. They were so sure of it that when it did not happen, they were still explaining it to each other 20 years later. Here is what was actually going on, as far as anybody can establish it, and the sources for it are 3. The Dowager Duchess's letters, which survive in quantity. Lady Emily Massingham's journal, which is short and dry and completely honest. And one conversation the Duke of Rayshalt had with his agent at Stowmarden that the agent wrote down that night, because he thought it was remarkable. The Dowager Duchess did not scold her son. She was cleverer than that. She did something much harder to withstand, which was to be reasonable at him. In writing, at intervals, for 4 months, her letters do not contain one unkind word about Honor Trewin, whom she had never met and never once names, she writes about the Ilminster connection, about his father, about the Stomarden purchase, about a living at Weyburn that wanted filling, and every 8 or 9 lines there is a sentence like, "I do not ask you to explain yourself to me, only to yourself." That is not a mother being cold. That is a woman of 60 who has understood exactly what her son is doing and has calculated, correctly, that the only thing that will stop him is his own sense of duty, and who is therefore going to hold his duty up in front of him every fortnight until he looks at it. Lady Emily's journal is where the human part is. She was 26 and unmarried, and she liked her brother very much, and her entry for the 15th of May says only, "A walked again. Mamma did not speak at dinner. I find I do not know what I think." Her entry for the 12th of June says, "I have met Miss Trewin at last, at the Hastwells, where she was sat with the 2 old ladies, and did it very well. She is not what the county says she is. She is not a schemer, and she is not a beauty either, and I begin to think Aubrey is in a good deal more trouble than any of us supposed." And her entry for the 2nd of July, which is the one that gets quoted, says, "I asked Aubrey tonight whether he knew what he was about. He said that he did. I asked him whether he had spoken to her, and he said no. I asked him why not, and he said, because she has nowhere to go, and if I speak, and she says yes, I shall never know whether she said it because she wished to, or because there is nowhere else in England for her, and I will not do that to her. I said that was all very fine, but that he was ruining her reputation by inches, while he waited to be sure of his own conscience. He was quiet a long while. Then he said, I know. I have not worked out how to do this and not do harm, and I am doing harm. That is the whole of the Duke of Rayshot's difficulty, and it is a real one, and it does not have a clean answer. He could not court her, because she was in her aunt's house and had nothing. And a proposal to a woman in that position is not a question. It is a rescue. And a rescue is not a marriage. He had seen enough of those. He could not stop, because stopping would have confirmed to 90 people that the walks had been a whim and finished her more completely than anything else could. And he could not explain himself to her, because explaining would have forced the very answer he did not trust. So he did the only thing left, which was to keep walking and let it cost what it cost. And it cost. The Ilminster connection went first, and it went quietly and permanently. Lady Georgiana Havers married a man called Fanshawe in the following spring, a match everybody agreed was very suitable, and she had 4 children and lived until 1861, and when she was old she was asked about the Suffolk summer by a niece, and what she said was, he was perfectly honest with me, which was more than I had any right to expect, and I have never once been sorry for how it fell out. That is the last of Lady Georgiana in this story, and she deserves better than a story that has no room for her. The second cost was the county itself, and it worked slowly, and it worked in the way these things always work, which is through invitations. The Duke of Rayshot was not cut. Nobody in Suffolk was going to cut a duke. What happened instead was that between June and September, he stopped being asked to the kind of gathering where a man's daughters are put in front of him, and started being asked to the kind where he was the ornament of the evening, and nothing else was expected of him, and by the end of the summer every hostess in 300s had privately reclassified him as a man who was not going to marry. Sensibly. That is a real loss, and it is very hard to describe as one, because nothing visible happened. But a man of that rank at 31 who is quietly reclassified in that way does not get reclassified back. The third cost was his mother. And the third cost was the one that mattered. The Dowager Duchess of Rayshalt left Stow Marden on the 9th of August and went into Hertfordshire and did not write to her son again until the following February. 6 months. From a woman who had written to him every fortnight for 7 years. Lady Emily's Journal, the 10th of August, Mamma gone. Aubrey saw her to the carriage and stood in the road until it was out of the gate, and then went in and worked at the Weyburn papers until 2 in the morning. He has said nothing to me about it, and I do not intend to ask. And the fourth cost has no letters and no journal, and it is the one Honor Trewin paid, and it went on the entire time. 11 weeks of an aunt who looked past her at dinner, a county that discussed her by name in rooms she was sitting in the third person, as a difficulty. 2 invitations withdrawn from the hall in July, with reasons given that were not reasons. Her cousin Amelia, 19 and not unkind, being told by her mother in Honor's hearing that she was not to walk in the village with Honor at present. And the small, careful way Amelia went on doing it anyway on a Thursday when her mother was at Hadley. And every Sunday the road. She never once asked him what he meant by it. In 4 months and 11 days she never asked, and he never said, and they walked 2 miles and a quarter and talked about the field path, and books, and his brother, and the drainage at Stow Marden, which she turned out to understand better than his agent did, because she had been going through a mortgaged baronet's household books every Friday for 4 years, and could read a set of accounts the way other people read a face. It is worth having the shape of those walks, because 18 Sundays is not a montage, and they did not spend them gazing at one another. The first 4 were formal and rather uncomfortable, and consisted largely of the field path, the weather, and the state of the Ardwell Road, which is what 2 people talk about when one of them is a duke, and the other has been told in public that she does not mind walking. From about the 5th, she began to answer him properly instead of correctly. And there is a difference. And he noticed it. And Lady Emily's Journal for the 5th of June has a line about her brother coming in from the road in an unusually good temper, and not saying why. In June they argued twice, the first time about a book, which she had read and he had not, and had pretended to. The second time about the Weyburn living, which she said he was thinking about as a piece of property and not as 300 people, and about which she was largely right, and said so at some length between the Ardwell turn and the lodge. In July it rained on 3 Sundays out of 4, and they walked in it, and he stopped offering her the carriage after the second one, because she had said no twice, and he had understood that the offer had become a way of reminding her that she could not accept it. And in August they talked about money, which no one had ever discussed with her in her life, because there had never been any point. That is how he found out what she was. Not on the first walk, in the middle of August, on the Ardwell Road, over drainage. He said afterward that it was the single most frightening thing that happened to him that year, because up to that point he had been a man doing something honourable at a cost, which is a position a man can hold indefinitely. And after it he was a man in love with a woman he had no honourable way to ask. The last Sunday of that summer, the 28th of August, it rained from the Ardwell turn all the way to the Hall gate, hard, for nearly 40 minutes. His carriage was 11 feet behind them the entire way, empty, at a walking pace, in the rain. She said, without looking at him, that he might get into it. And the Duke of Rayshalt said, "So might you." And Honor Trewin said no, and they walked the rest of it in the rain, and she was ill for 9 days afterward, and that was the end of the summer, and he went into Hertfordshire on the 4th of September, and the county said, "There, you see." He was gone 19 weeks. That is the part of this that nobody tells properly, because it is 19 weeks of nothing happening, and nothing happening is very hard to make interesting, and is where the whole thing was actually decided. From the 4th of September to the 15th of January, the Duke of Rayshalt was in Hertfordshire and at Weyburn, and for 5 weeks in London. And he did not write to Honor Trewin, and she did not write to him, because there was no possible way for either of them to write to the other that would not have been a ruin. An unmarried woman of no standing receiving a letter from a duke, in a house where the letters came in on a tray and were sorted in the hall by a butler who had been with the family 30 years. There is no version of that which is private. She knew it. He knew it. So there were no letters, and this is the reason there is no correspondence between them from that autumn, and why people have spent 200 years assuming there was nothing to correspond about. What there was instead, in Ardwell, was the winter. Lady Sarah Ferrers began speaking to her niece again on the 11th of September, 1 week after the Duke left the county, and she did it the way people do, which is to say she simply started, at breakfast, about a bonnet, as though the 11 weeks had been a spell of weather. Honor Trewin answered her about the bonnet. She was asked about that, too, years later, how she could sit down at that table and answer about a bonnet. And her answer is one of the 2 or 3 sentences that make her worth writing about. She said, "My aunt had given me the only thing she had it in her power to give me back, which was ordinary conversation. It would have been a very poor sort of pride to refuse it, because it came late. And the county, having been proved right, was generous about it, which is the worst part. Nobody crowed. 2 or 3 of the older women were noticeably kind to Miss Trewin that autumn, at the Hastwells and at the harvest supper and in the churchyard, and the kindness was genuine and it was unbearable, because every ounce of it was the kindness people show to somebody who has had a disappointment and behaved well about it. She was 23, and she had been publicly assigned an ending. It is worth setting out what that ending was, in the plain arithmetic of it, because the modern ear hears companion and thinks of a job. It was not a job. There were no wages, so there was nothing to save, so there was no year in which the position improved. A paid companion at least accumulated something. An unpaid relation accumulated only the goodwill of the household, and goodwill is not transferable and cannot be spent anywhere else. At 30, she would be doing exactly what she was doing at 23, with the difference that Amelia would be married and gone, and there would be no one in the house nearer her own age. At 40, she would be doing it for a woman of 68, and the question that hangs over every one of these arrangements would be about 8 or 10 years off. What becomes of the companion when the person she is companion to dies? The answer in that county, in that period, was that she goes to the next relation who will have her, and there is always one further down, and the rooms get colder each time. Honor Trewin knew 3 women who had gone that road. One of them was living at Hadley, in 2 rooms on £40 a year from a cousin, and Honor had been sent to sit with her twice. So when the Duke of Rayshalt spent 4 months refusing to make an offer she could not safely refuse, He was not being fastidious about a nicety. He had looked at that road and understood that a woman standing on it cannot say no to a duke, and that a yes obtained from a person with no alternative is not a yes. He was right about it. He was also, for 4 of those months, the only person in Suffolk in a position to act, and he did not act, and she paid for the delay in a currency he was never billed in. Now what was happening in Hertfordshire? 3 things, and all 3 of them are dull. And being dull is the whole point, because this is a story about a man of enormous rank who did not do one single dramatic thing in the entire 19 weeks. The first was the Weyburn living, which he filled in October with a curate named Aldous, and which matters here only because the man he did not give it to was a nephew of the Marquess of Ilminster, and the Suffolk view of that was that Rayshalt had shut the door on the Ilminster connection for good, and the Suffolk view was correct. The second was his mother. He went into Hertfordshire and lived in the same county as the Dowager Duchess of Rayshalt for 4 months, and they did not meet. She was at Bramworth, 11 miles from him. He wrote to her twice. Both letters survive because she kept everything. Neither is answered. They are short, and they are not pleading, and the second one, dated the 11th of November, has 3 sentences in it that Lady Emily copied into her journal and that have been quoted ever since. He wrote, "I have not asked her, and I do not know that I shall be able to. I am aware of what it costs, and I am aware that some of what it costs is being paid by you, and that I have no right to spend it. I ask you to believe that I am not doing it to be admired, since there is nobody left to admire it." She did not answer that either, but she kept it in a folded packet with her husband's letters, which is a fact somebody found out in 1892, and which is worth more than an answer. The third thing was the money. And the money is the reason this story does not end where the county thought it would. The Duke of Rayshalt spent the autumn of 1814 doing something extremely tedious with his agent, which was going through the settlements on his 3 sisters, of whom 2 were dead, and the wardships, and a chain of very old family obligations to connections of connections, and working out. This took 11 weeks, and a London attorney. What a man in his position could and could not do about a person he was not related to, and did not intend to be related to, except by marrying her. And the answer was, nothing. Nothing at all. He could not settle money on Honor Trewin. He could not create her an income, or an annuity, or a place, or a competence, or anything else that would have given her the one thing she needed in order to be able to say no to him, not because it was legally impossible, because it was socially annihilating. Any provision made by a duke for a portionless young woman in another man's house in 1814 has exactly one interpretation in the mind of every single person who hears about it, and that interpretation ends her. He worked at that problem for 11 weeks with a London attorney before he accepted that there was no way through it, and the note his agent made of the conversation in which he finally accepted it is 4 words long. His Grace much cast down. So he came back into Suffolk in January, with nothing solved and nothing to offer, and the whole of it still exactly where it had been in August, except for one thing, which was that he had stopped believing that waiting was honorable. That is the turn, and it is not a dramatic one, and it happened in a room by himself. He had spent 4 months protecting Honor Trewin from being proposed to by a man she could not refuse. And somewhere in that autumn, Lady Emily thought it was after the attorney, and she is probably right. He understood that he had been protecting her from an offer while leaving her to bear every single consequence of it, which is the arrangement that suits the man and nobody else. She was paying the price of being courted and getting none of the courtship. He had been calling that scruple. It was, he decided, a way of keeping his own conscience tidy at her expense, and he had been doing it for 4 months. He came back to Stowmarden on the 15th of January, 1815. He did not call at Ardwell Hall. He did not write. He did not send. He went to church. Sunday the 22nd of January, 1815, morning service at Ardwell, and there were rather more than 140 people in that building, which is more than it seats, because word had gone round the parish on the Friday that the Duke of Rayshalt was back in the county, and it was very cold and there was nothing else to do. Now, the seating. This has to be understood exactly, or the whole thing is just a man walking about a church. The Rayshalt family pew at Ardwell was the front pew on the south side, and it was not a bench. It was a box, panelled to shoulder height, with a door and a stove of its own, and a family crest cut into the panelling, and it had been the Massingham pew since 1681. In a parish church of that period, the pews were the county's rank, written down the length of the building, front to back, and everybody in Ardwell could have recited the order of it without thinking. The Ferrers' pew was 4th from the front, on the north side, and the dependents, the poor relations, the upper servants who were not in the servants' gallery, the companions, sat on the backless benches at the west end under the tower, behind the font, where it was cold and where the rector's voice arrived about a quarter of a second late. Honor Trewin had sat on the 4th bench under the tower every Sunday for 4 years and 3 months. Because the Ferrers' pew held 4, and there were 4 Ferrerses, and the winter of 1815 was a hard one, and the tower end of Ardwell Church in January was very cold indeed. The Duke of Rayshalt came in with his sister at about 5 minutes before the hour, and went up the south aisle to the Rayshalt pew, and the whole church watched him do it, and he opened the door of it, and handed Lady Emily in, and did not go in himself. He turned round and walked back down the aisle. 140 people watched a duke walk the entire length of Ardwell Church, from the chancel step to the font, in the 4 minutes before a morning service, in complete silence, and every single one of them knew where he was going before he was halfway. He stopped at the 4th bench under the tower. Honor Trewin stood up. She said afterward that she stood up because she had no idea what else to do, and that she was so cold she could not feel her hands, and that her first coherent thought was that her aunt was going to be very angry. And the Duke of Rayshalt took her hand in front of 140 people and walked her the whole length of that church, up the middle of the nave, past the Ferrers' pew and past the Hastewells and past every family in the parish of Ardwell, and opened the door of the Rayshalt pew and put her into it. And then he shut the door and stood outside it, in the aisle, because a box pew of that period holds 4 at a squeeze, and there were already 2 in it. And there was nowhere for him to sit. He stood in the aisle beside his own family pew for 1 hour and 10 minutes, through the whole of the morning service, in front of the entire parish, while a portionless naval officer's daughter sat in the seat his family had held for 134 years. There was one moment in that hour and 10 minutes that 4 separate people thought worth recording, and it was not a dramatic one. At the psalm, the whole congregation stood, and standing is what the rest of the church did, and what he had been doing for 20 minutes already. So for the length of the psalm, the Duke of Raysholt was simply a man on his feet in a church among 140 other people on their feet, and nothing about him was strange at all. And then they all sat down, and he did not, because there was nowhere for him to sit. Mr. Bradnam said afterward that that was the moment the thing became unbearable to watch, and that he had to look at the book. Amelia Ferrers wrote that her father put his hand over his eyes, and Lady Emily, who was 4 feet away from her brother on the other side of the panelling and could not see him at all, wrote only that she heard the whole church sit down and knew that he had not. He did not look at anybody. Mr. Bradnam, who was 71 and had christened half that building, later said that he got through the service by pretending very hard that nothing whatever was happening, and that his voice went at the second lesson. The Dowager Duchess of Raysholt was in that church. Nobody had known she was coming. She had arrived at Stow Marden on the Saturday night from Hertfordshire after 5 months of silence, and had come to church in the morning with her son and her daughter, and she was sitting in the Raysholt pew when Honor Trewin was put into it. She got up and left. She went out by the south door before the first hymn, in front of 140 people, at a walk, without hurry, in the middle of it. That is the cost, and there is no arguing about it, and everybody in that building understood every part of it at the time. What happened in the 10 minutes after that service is better recorded than anything else in this story, because 140 people all wanted to tell somebody about it, and about 30 of them wrote it down within the week. Nothing happened. The service ended. The Duke of Raysholt opened the door of the pew, and Honor Trewin came out of it, and he offered her his arm, and she took it, and they went down the aisle and out through the south porch into the churchyard, where it was about 2 degrees of frost, and the entire parish came out behind them and stood about in the cold, pretending to look for their carriages. He did not make an announcement. There was no announcement then or that week. He walked her to the church gate, and Sir Marcus Ferrers was standing at it with his hat off, which he had never in 4 years done for his niece, and Lady Sarah Ferrers was standing beside him with a face that 11 separate people described afterward, and none of them the same way. And the Duke of Raysholt said to Sir Marcus, in the hearing of everybody at that gate, that he would call at Ardwell Hall on Tuesday if it was convenient. Sir Marcus said that it was. And then Honor Trewin got into the Ferrers' carriage, because she had been handed into it by her uncle, and she went home in it for the first time in 4 years and 3 months, and the Duke of Raysholt walked back up the Ardwell Road on his own with his carriage behind him, which is a detail that has always been enjoyed, and which he almost certainly did not intend as anything at all. He called on the Tuesday. Between the Sunday and the Tuesday, the parish of Ardwell did not talk about anything else, and the shape the talk took is the whole reason a public act works and a private kindness does not. Nobody was in any doubt about what they had seen. That is the first thing. There was no ambiguity to be argued over, no version in which he had been merely courteous, because a man who stands in an aisle for 70 minutes has removed every alternative reading himself. He had made it impossible to be misunderstood, which is the only thing a gesture is for. The second thing is that his mother's leaving was understood as clearly as his standing was. 140 people had watched the price be paid at the same moment as the act, and the two could not afterwards be separated by anybody in any drawing room in that county, however much they might have wished to. And the third thing is what it did to Lady Sarah Ferrers, which was not what anybody would predict. She did not rage and she did not apologize. She went home from that church and sat in her own drawing room, and at some point on the Sunday evening, she went upstairs to the cold room above the still room, which she had not entered in 4 years, and looked at it. Amelia Ferrers, who was 19 and who wrote it down, says that her mother came back down after about 10 minutes and sat by the fire and said nothing at all for the rest of the evening, and that on the Monday morning she gave orders that the blue bedroom on the first floor was to be made up for Miss Trewin, and that a fire was to be kept in it. Nobody had told her to. Nobody had said one word to her. She had simply been made, in front of everybody, to see her own house from the outside for the length of a morning service, and she moved her niece 2 floors and 1 whole world before the Duke of Rayshalt ever set foot in her hall. Honor Trewin slept in the blue bedroom on the Monday night, and it is recorded by Amelia that she thanked her aunt for it, and that neither of them said anything else about it, then or afterward, for the rest of their lives. That is what a public act does that a private kindness cannot. A private kindness would have been a secret between 2 people, and would have changed nothing in that house. This changed the arrangement of the bedrooms. He asked Sir Marcus Ferrers for permission to address his niece, and got it, and then he asked to speak to her alone, and got that too, in the small parlour at the front of the house, with the door open, because that was the form. And he made an extremely bad job of it. We know this because she told people for 50 years with enormous pleasure, and her account of it never varied, and was clearly true. He said, to begin with, a long and very careful sentence about her position, and his own and the difficulty of the last year, which she let him get about 2/3 of the way through. Then he started again, and said that he was conscious he had done her harm, and that he had spent 4 months telling himself he was protecting her, when what he was actually doing was arranging matters so that he need never risk anything, and that he had understood this in November and had been ashamed of it ever since. Then he stopped and said, I have nothing to offer you that you have any way of refusing safely, and that is my doing, and I cannot undo it. So I am going to ask you anyway, and I am going to ask you here, in your uncle's house, where you have people about you, and I want you to know that if you say no, I shall go into Hertfordshire on Thursday, and you will not be troubled with any of it again. And your position in this house will be exactly what it was, because I have told your uncle so in front of your aunt. And Honor Trewin said, You have told my uncle so? And he said yes, and she said that in that case he had thought about it a great deal more carefully than she had, and that she had made up her mind on the Ardwell Road in the middle of August, and had been waiting since then to find out whether he ever would. They were married on the 11th of April, 1815, at Ardwell, by Mr. Bradnam, who by all accounts enjoyed himself very much. Now the rest of it, because a wedding is not an ending, and this is the part that decides whether any of it was worth doing. The Dowager Duchess of Rayshalt was not at the wedding. She came to Suffolk in the June, 8 weeks after it, and she and her son met in the drawing room at Stow Marden, and were in that room together for about an hour and a half, and then she was introduced to her daughter-in-law, and the two women went for a walk in the garden, and were gone until it was nearly dark. Nobody knows what was said on that walk. Both of them were asked. Neither ever told anybody. The first months at Stow Marden were harder than the courtship, and almost nobody tells that part, because it is not romantic, and it is where the thing was actually won. A duchess who has been a companion arrives in a house of 40 servants who all know exactly what she was in March, and there is no possible way for her to pretend otherwise, and no possible way for them to forget it. The housekeeper at Stow Marden, a Mrs. Ponsfoot, had been in that house 22 years, and had, by her own admission long afterward, made up her mind against the marriage before she ever saw the bride. What she said, when she was an old woman, is the best short account of Honor Massingham that anybody has left. She said, "I waited a fortnight for her to give herself airs, because they all do at first, the ones who come up. And she never did it, and I waited another fortnight, and then she asked me to go through the linen with her, because she said she did not know how a house this size was run, and would I teach her? And I have never in my life been so put out, because I had a great deal ready to say and no occasion to say any of it." She learned that house the way she had learned Ardwell, on paper on a Friday, in a hand that did not blot. And she made one rule in the first year of her marriage which she kept for 39 years, and which the whole household knew about, and it is the only thing she is recorded as ever having been rigid about. Nobody at Stow Marden walked home from anything. Not a housemaid, not a garden boy, not a curate, not a poor relation of anybody's. If there were people at that house, and the weather was bad, and the hour was late, they went home in a carriage, and the Duchess of Rayshult would get up from her own dinner table to see that it was done. She never explained it to anybody, and nobody ever needed her to. What is known is that the Dowager Duchess of Rayshult spent the following winter at Stow Marden, and every winter after that until she died in 1828, and that in her will she left her own mother's pearls to honor Duchess of Rayshult, and left them with a line in her own hand that said, "To my son's wife," who was right and I was not, and who has never once mentioned it. The county came round more slowly and less completely. It never entirely stopped being a thing that was known about her. 20 years on, in 1835, a woman at a dinner in Bury could still say, and did, that the Duchess of Rayshult had been a companion at Ardwell, and mean something by it. There were houses that were correct with her for 30 years, and never warm. That is the truth about a marriage like that one, and it does not get soft with time. She was, by every account there is, extremely good at the work. She had spent 4 years going through a mortgaged baronet's household books every Friday, and she went through a duchy's the same way, and the Rayshult estate accounts from 1816 onward are in a different hand and a different order, and are, according to a man who studied them in 1931, the best kept private accounts of that period he had seen. She ran the Stow Marden school. She had 6 children, and buried the second one. She was Duchess of Rayshult for 39 years, and outlived her husband by 11. Amelia Ferrers married a clergyman in 1819 and went into Norfolk and had a long, unremarkable, contented life, and she and her cousin wrote to one another every month for 41 years. and the letters are the reason a great deal of this is known at all. In 1869, going through what was left after her cousin died, Amelia found that Honor had kept every one of those letters in order, tied in 11 bundles, and had also kept, in the first bundle, a note in Amelia's 19-year-old hand from July of 1814, which said only, "I am going to the village on Thursday, and I should like it very much if you came." And she never once in 39 years travelled from Ardwell Church to a house of hers in a carriage without the 2 miles and a quarter of that road being to her that road. Her husband died in 1854. Her own memorial in Ardwell Church is on the south wall by the front pew, and the inscription on it is 9 words long, and she chose it herself, in advance, in 1849, and it says, "She was brought up this church by the hand." Now here is the thing about this story that is worth your 15 minutes, and it is not the pew, and it is not the wedding. Look at what he actually did. He never gave her anything. Not one thing. There is no settlement in this story, no money, no house, no place found for her, no relation spoken to on her behalf, no problem solved with a cheque, and that is not because he was poor. He was one of the richest men in England, and he spent 11 weeks and a London attorney establishing that there was no amount of money on earth that could help her. And there was not. And he was right. Everything that was actually done in this story, he did with his own body, in front of witnesses, at his own expense. He got out of a carriage. He walked 2 miles and a quarter in the rain. He walked the length of a church and took her hand and put her in his family's pew, and then stood in the aisle for 70 minutes because there was nowhere left for him to sit. That is all. That is the entire mechanism. And it worked. It changed the position of a portionless woman in a county that had assigned her a bench under a tower, because rank in that world was not a thing you owned. It was a thing that was continuously agreed by everybody watching, and a man who spends it publicly in front of the people whose agreement constitutes it is the only person who can move it, and it only counts when it costs him and everybody can see the price. His mother left by the south door in the middle of the service. That is the price, paid in public, in front of the people it had to be paid in front of. There is somebody near you who is standing at the back of a room because everybody has quietly agreed that is where they stand, and nobody in that room is being cruel, and everybody would be genuinely startled to be told there was anything wrong with it. You cannot fix that by feeling differently about it. Feeling differently about it costs nothing, and a thing that costs nothing moves nothing. Who would you cross the room for if the whole room were watching and you knew exactly what it would cost you?